now.
Live from Washington, this is a CGTN special report.
I'm Mike Walter in Washington, joined by a team of correspondents and guests from around the world. Over the next half hour, we'll hear from all of them. Elaine Reyes is on Capitol Hill. Bring some important perspective. Tianwei is in Beijing. And let's begin with Nathan King, who is inside one of the most historic rooms of the U.S. Capitol. Statuary Hall. It's the meeting place of the House of Representatives from much of the 1800s. Nathan, important to note the historic significance of this night.
Yeah, absolutely. There have been a lot of presidents, and a lot of their statues surrounding here, looking down on U.S. President Donald Trump as he arrives in about half an hour or so to make this speech. Now, it's a chance for him to look presidential, isn't it? When, let's face it, not at times does he fit easily into the role. The State of the Union is strong, usually every president says in one point in the speech. Can he really say that? We'll wait and see. But it's also it's not just about giving policy. It's about a performance not just in front of the House of Representatives and the senators and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the judges and, of course, everyone watching in the balcony as well and guests, but also the millions of Americans who don't normally tune in to the politics of back and forth between Democrats and Republicans, but actually tune in once a year or so to see their president and his priorities going forward. It's a chance for him to look presidential and reach out beyond his base. Now, we know from excerpts from his speech he will be trying to do that. Can you believe it? In this divided town, he's actually saying we should work together more, come and unite, although he's thin on proposals on how to do so. But it will be an upbeat tone, we're told, especially about the economy. He'll be talking about a new American moment. No better time, he's going to say, to start following the American dream.
But Nathan, as you point out, it is a divided city. Some members of Congress aren't even going to attend tonight. Even some members of the Supreme Court won't be in attendance. But let's talk about China. This address comes at a very interesting time in relations between those two countries. Dive into that, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I'm going to be very interested in whether he actually says the word China in his speech, because he's avoided saying the word China, but given some very, very interesting speeches, like, for example, in Davos at the World Economic Forum, where he basically talked about trade imbalances, and everyone knew that he was talking about China. Now, we know of the solar panel decision and the washing machine decision, and we've got impending steel and aluminum decisions coming down, that there could be more trade problems with China, and we understand that he will address those in his speech, although whether he'll say China or not will be interesting. And it's going to be very interesting to see if he lays a path for that in 2018. One area, in strategic area, he will be talking about is the DPRK's missile and nuclear program. We understand that he will have very, very strong language when it comes to that. In the excerpts that he's released, he's talked about we do not give concessions, or complacency in the past has led to aggression. That looks like he's going to still take a very long, different and strong line against the DPRK.
Nathan, thanks so much. Of course, people from around the world will be watching, world leaders will be watching, but as I pointed out, some of the majority of the top justices in the country, the Supreme Court, they're not going to be at the speech tonight. Some are ill, some have other plans, and also worth noting, Democratic lawmakers, at least a dozen of them, they're protesting the president. They're not going to be in attendance, but Sean Calebs will be here with us all night long in conversation. He'll be watching the address. This has been going on for some time. Trump, of course, this is his first State of the Union, although he did address a joint session of Congress in 2017, but it hadn't been in office long enough to be a State of the Union. Talk to me about that speech.
Yeah, and I think we have to realize that that speech, which came February 28, 2017, really came 5 weeks after his inaugural address. And really, his inaugural address caught a lot of people off guard. If you remember at the time, he was very America-centric, saying basically it's America first, second, third, fourth. Everything else was kind of atmospheric at that point. And during his inaugural address, he went on to say, the American carnage stops right here, right now. And that really resonated with a lot of people. Like, is this the way our leader is going to talk moving forward. So a lot of people were watching what he was going to say when he addressed the Congress on February 28th. And if you look at what he said back then, on February 28th, he called on lawmakers to send a bill to his desk to replace Obamacare. He wanted to build the wall with Mexico immediately. He wanted to give funding to the U.S. military, and he wanted to pump up billions of dollars into the United States depleted roads and highways. So where has that gone, Mike? At this point, none of that has happened. So he's going to have to sound more presidential this evening. You're looking at a live shot of the proceedings right now. There are a lot of lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, but right now they're all smiles and all chummy. And what we expect to hear, as Nathan said, is Trump to sound presidential. And that means he can't throw in those nicknames that he chides people on in Twitter, referring to the head of the DPRK as Rocket Man, his former presidential opponent as Crooked Hillary. And you can go down the list, people within his own party blasting the Democratic leader, Charles Schumer, as crying Chuck. So he's got to get away from that. He's got to sound presidential. He's got to stick to the teleprompter. He has been able to do this in the past, Mike. The question is he going to sound a bipartisan tone? Is he going to try to do some of these things, tackle immigration, find a way to move forward on the DPRK, and talk about the trade imbalance with China without rattling the saber at the same time?
And we see the Speaker Paul Ryan there, the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, taking their places. They'll be sitting behind the president as he makes the address. There's Senator Ted Cruz from Texas. How different from Obama's last State of the Union address is this going to be, do you think? Because he certainly tried to stake out a different position, and if it's anything doing with Obama, he wants to undo it.
Exactly. And if you go back and listen to what Obama said when he left office, his last State of the Union address in 2016, it was more or less a victory lap. He wanted to talk about tremendous strides that the world had taken in attacking climate change, the historic Paris Accord that he and President Xi really pushed through with dozens of other nations signing on board, which Trump has very famously now said that he wants the United States to pull out of that. He talked about engaging all citizens in improving education, in improving wages. It was really a kind of come together, like, this is my victory lap. We've done a lot of wonderful things, better health care. And then just a matter of months later, you hear Donald Trump come out and talk, and it's not even like they're talking about the same country, but not even the same globe at this point. So it was dramatically different what we heard from former President Obama and then Donald Trump with his very America-centric talk, and we'll find out if we hear more about that. The theme tonight is Safe, Strong, and Proud America.
And we're seeing a number of the senators filing in. Just a moment ago, we saw Senator Jeff Flake, who's a Republican, who staked out an entirely different position from the U.S. president, and Bernie Sanders just entering just a moment ago. Well, in just a moment, we'll talk about the deep divisions here in the United States, but let's first go beyond the U.S. borders. Frank Contreras is our correspondent in Mexico City. He'll join us to discuss Trump's immigration and economic plans. But let's start, though, with Tian Wei, anchor of World Insight on CGTN. What are you expecting to hear from President Trump?
Well, Mike, we are expecting something very different from the tone of the inaugural speech President Trump delivered almost a year ago. At the time, internationally, he's talking about America first, and domestically, it's a divided America. 1 year later, probably this president, even though combining politics with entertainment, has already learned some lessons, some learning curve, to say the least. We hope there are some tones that we picked up over the past few weeks that's likely to help us understand better about what is he likely to say and how is he likely to say it. At the recent concluded World Economic Forum in Davos, he's delivered, I have to say, a WEF-friendly version of his rhetorics. He's talking about friendship and partnership and also America first, but not America alone, even though many of the participants there who are believers of globalization did not know exactly what kind of roadmap he has in mind. And secondly, he's been recently, according to press report, talking to the White House, talking to the journalists from all over the world, trying to indicate this is going to be a very presidential speech. So all things are pointing to a more presidential State of the Union address. And yet in these days, when politics and rhetoric are so far away from actions, seeing is believing, not hearing is believing. By the way, from China's perspective, Mike, there are several things people are really looking at and hearing very closely. One, of course, is the DPRK nuclear issue, which is going to have a big impact on the security issue in Northeast Asia. China is going to be a play a big role in that regard. Secondly, it's the trade issue. We are seeing tensions between the two countries when it comes to trade, particularly talking about only jobs bringing in to America. But what about China? What about the rest of the world? The rest of the world is watching, Mike, I think, at this point. That is, when America is first and America is good alone, it's not going to make the world better. And when the rest of the world is not better, America certainly is not going to thrive. Mike.
Tianwei, you know, as we get set to hear President Trump's State of the Union address, let's reflect back a little bit on what Trump said while campaigning for president.
Well, as you...
When was the last time anybody saw us beating, let's say, China in a trade deal? They kill us.
We can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing. It's the greatest theft in the history of the world.
So, Tianwei, let's pick it up there. Some very critical comments on China there. In fact, as we've watched, his relationship has just kind of gyrated all over the place. So give me your sense. How has this relationship with President Xi Jinping evolved?
Mike, when you are playing those sound bites of President Trump during his campaign trail, I was making faces here in the studio in Beijing. You know, there has been a sea difference of attitude between then the candidate Trump and now President Trump, particularly after some very close interactions between President Trump and President Xi Jinping of China. We see the Mar-a-Lago meeting between the two. Later, President Trump making a state visit to China. Every time there have been comprehensive discussions between the two state leaders about the DPRK nuclear issue, about the trade issue, and also even global governance issue. Of course, America is looking at its own interests, particularly with this president. He's already said it very clearly. So we can probably expect some specific points coming out about trade issues with China, maybe some tough tones. Meanwhile, about the DPRK issue, we heard already some rhetoric coming from the White House talking about a hard tone possibly in the State of the Union address, particularly toward the DPRK, the country itself. But at this point, China, I think many people here are hopeful, trying to see a more presidential Donald Trump from the United States and also a more responsible United States of America. We should play a constructive role in our world, not a destructive role. Back to you, Mike.
Tianwei, thanks so much. Let's move on now to Mexico City and Frank Contreras. Frank, let's start with immigration. It's been a focus of Trump since the day he declared his candidacy. Let's listen to this.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. Yes, we're going to have the wall, and yes, Mexico is going to pay for the wall 100%.
Now Trump says he's trying to unify the country and reform immigration. How is Mexico viewing Trump right now?
Well, Mexicans, Mike, really can't forget those words that President Trump uttered back when he was a candidate. At this stage now, we know that the Mexican president tonight, Enrique Peña Nieto, is in behind-doors meetings with his cabinet officials at this very moment. We're told that he's going to be keeping a very careful eye on the speech that President Trump delivers today in Washington, tonight in Washington. We're also told that Mexico's Foreign Relations Minister, Luis Videgaray, will be analyzing every word that comes out of the U.S. president's mouth, knowing that anything negative in reference to Mexico could affect things like the value of the Mexican peso against the dollar, which has been very volatile during this first year of the Trump presidency, Mike. And so there's been a major impact on the Mexican economy, largely because of the presence of Trump in the White House there. In terms of national polls on what Mexicans think now about the U.S. president, there really haven't been any polls taken on that matter. But we did put out the word on social media tonight, Mike, and asked a few people on the way here. A couple of Mexican citizens here in the Capitol said they weren't even aware that the U.S. president would be delivering this first State of the Nation speech tonight in Washington. On social media, they were quite aware, and people there were, I would say, quite negative, Mike. They said things like, he's a national embarrassment. Another woman said that he's the legitimate representative of many U.S. citizens. But then she added,
Frank, if I could just interrupt for just a second. Frank, just a moment. The president himself right now getting into the limo, getting prepared to take him over to Capitol Hill and the U.S. Capitol, where he will deliver that address. He's now inside the limo. This will be a short motorcade that will take him from the White House at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue There won't be any traffic because they'll clear all of that for him, and it will be a speedy jaunt over to the U.S. Capitol. But let's continue our conversation, Frank, because one of the things he said last year when he spoke to the joint session of Congress, again, it wasn't a State of the Union address. He'd only been in office for a short time, but at that time he said he was going to build this great, big, beautiful wall. Developments on the border wall and having Mexico pay for it, where does that stand today?
Well, Mexico has reiterated, and the Mexican government, of course, has reiterated repeatedly that it will do no such thing. It will not be paying for the wall. Former Mexican President Vicente Fox took a very much more negative position on that, saying things that I probably shouldn't repeat on this broadcast. Today, however, we do know that the White House Budget Director, Mike Mulvaney, said that the wall would cost the United States somewhere around $18 billion. He did not mention whether or not they would be asking tonight, whether or not Mr. Trump would be asking Mexico to pay for that. So again, the stance that Mexico's been taking overall has been, no, we won't pay for the wall, Mike.
All right, Frank Contreras live for us. Thanks so much. And again, you're looking at the pictures there of the motorcade making its way as we speak to the U.S. Capitol. The undeniable bright spot of Trump's first year in office, the stock market. The major indices have all gained nearly 50% since inauguration day. The national unemployment rate is low. But there's a racial divide Trump has not been able to tackle just yet. Elaine Reyes joins us with that. Elaine?
Mike, the unemployment rate for Black Americans is higher than any other group in the United States, and it has been that way for generations. Take a look at this graphic. The line on the top is the unemployment rate among Black Americans. The line on the bottom, white Americans. Since the 1970s and even before, the Black unemployment rate has always been higher. Today, it's twice as high, and that's about average. Now the question, why? Experts say it's a combination of lack of access to quality education, endemic poverty in Black communities, and the list goes on. Study after study has shown that Black job applicants have a harder time getting hired than white applicants. And even when they get a job, Black Americans earn less than their white counterparts. Black Americans have less than 15% of the median wealth of white Americans. So tonight, President Trump is expected to point out a lower unemployment rate for Black Americans, but for many watching, that's just part of the story of what it means to be Black in America. Mike?
This is an important point to focus on because only 8% of African Americans voted for Trump. So how much work has to be done to bridge that divide? We're joined from Atlanta by Nsanga Burton. She's a chair of mass media arts at Clark Atlanta University. She's also a contributor to the Huffington Post and The Root, and we can't thank you enough for joining us. What's your take on what to expect to hear from the U.S. president with regards to this issue?
Well, I'm not quite sure what President Trump is going to say about African Americans, people of African descent. He has quite a hole to climb out of, considering his comments that he's made, the tweets, the Twitter war he's been trying to start with Jay-Z, and the comments that he made about a continent called Africa and a country, Caribbean country called Haiti. And it'll be interesting to see how he's going to dig himself out of that hole and try to bring people together when those words are so fresh on the minds of people of African descent throughout the world.
We talked a moment ago about the unemployment rate among Black Americans being twice as high as white Americans. The White House press secretary was asked yesterday what Trump's done to try and solve that problem. Let's listen.
I think you can see from the steps that we've already taken that we're trying to fix unemployment for all Americans. That's the point that the president has made time and time again, is that he wants it to be better for everybody. And we've made significant progress in that.
Do you buy that?
No, I don't buy it. I don't think that the president has any plans of doing anything for anyone who is not white and male and over age 60 and wealthy. So I don't see any policies particularly that he has passed or that anyone in his cabinet has supported that would suggest, or the Republican Party for that matter, that would suggest that people of African descent in general and African Americans in particular are on his agenda in any way, shape, or form.
During the presidential campaign, Trump's pitch to Black voters was a simple one. He said, pick me. What the hell do you have to lose? Those were his words, implying that the experience of every Black person in the U.S. was so bad, they had nothing to lose by voting for him. Now, some called that racist. Now, even some news anchors on networks like CNN, the sports network ESPN actually calling Trump a racist. Is that a fair criticism, or does it derail the broader conversation?
I think it's a fair criticism because those words actually derailed a broader conversation of what it means to be African American in this country, what it means to be of African descent in this country. We are not monolithic. We are a very diverse, complicated group of people, and we have different experiences and live in very different places. And we are lived throughout the entire country, not just in the inner cities. And so I think those comments is what derailed the conversation, a real conversation, an economic conversation, a socio-political conversation, a resource allocation conversation, and what it means when jobs are being shipped overseas. You know, working class whites are not the only people affected by that. So yeah, we would like to be a part of the conversation.
Is there anything he can do, in your estimation, to improve the lives of Black Americans, which do have higher poverty, unemployment, incarceration rates?
I think you'd have to take Black Americans seriously in order to want to do that. I think that it would help if he actually would liaise with people who actually have some expertise in African American issues, whether they're political, whether it's poverty, whether it's economic, or what have you. I think that would be a good start.
And Senga, thanks so much. And as she said, take them seriously, liaise more with Black Americans. It's interesting to look at his cabinet. The makeup there, I think anybody looking at that would say it's very, very white. And undoubtedly, the diversity that we've seen in other administrations, Obama, George W. Bush, not necessarily there with the Trump cabinet. Since last March, surveys have shown more than half of Americans disapproving of Trump's job performance. Today, 56% of them say they disapprove, 39% approve. And Nitza Soledad-Perez joins us now from the Florida city of Doral, where a group of Trump supporters will be watching his speech just minutes from now. Nitza, what are you hearing there?
Hello, Mike. Yes, I am at a GOP watch party hosted by the Women's Republican Club of Miami. And yes, this is a Cuban restaurant, but I am surrounded by Trump supporters of many, many different backgrounds. Immigration and Latino issues are expected to be front and center this evening. And yes, Dreamers will be attendees as well as Puerto Rican hurricane victims. But here, Trump supporters and many in the Republican Party are hoping for a uniting speech, a feel-good moment. I had the opportunity to talk to many of them earlier tonight, and what they want President Trump to do tonight is to tout his accomplishments. They want to hear about how good, according to them, the economy is doing, how the unemployment has fallen, how he's created jobs, how his policies are incentivizing companies to come back to the United States. That's what they want to hear. They want the cheerleader President Trump. Now, Mike, interestingly enough, and as many polls have suggested in the past, these Trump supporters do want a solution for the young undocumented migrants that were brought here as children, and that's what they were telling to me earlier. Also, this is contingent to securing the border. They do believe in that wall, either physical or virtual, but for them, it's really, really important to secure the border and to limit the legal migration. Again, these people are here because they voted for him, they believe in him, and according to them, the economic indicators are reflecting what he promised, a better economy for the United Nations, for the United States, and they are here to support him on his first State of the Union. Mike.
Nitza, thanks so much. Nitza reporting from Doral, Florida, where there's a group of supporters of Donald Trump there, and we just saw some of his members of the Supreme Court coming in, Chief Justice John Roberts, and of course Neil Gorsuch, who was one of the victories in this first year in office for Donald Trump. He was able to get Gorsuch through as one of his Supreme Court justices. Well, we're now just minutes away from the U.S. President's address to Congress. Any moment now, we'll see him walk into the House chamber. But as we get set for the address, we've got a panel with us, and Senga Burton still joining us from Atlanta, joining the conversation, Robert Moran. He's a partner at the Brunswick Group. He's a public opinion analyst. And from Beijing, CGTN current affairs commentator Einar Tangent. Robert, why don't I start with you? He's got kind of a tall order, doesn't he, in terms of messaging, because There's a lot of people in this country that aren't in his corner. He's got a base, but how does he broaden that? How does he talk to the rest of the U.S. and actually get people on board?
Well, you're right. His current ratings are 40% favorable, 56% unfavorable. That's a tough position for any president to be in. I do think he has a victory path to some extent. I think his team should focus hard on the economy. And I think if they were smart, they would focus this speech heavily on the economy because, and you referenced this earlier in your broadcast, consumer confidence in the United States is at a 17-year high. 68% of Americans feel that the economy is excellent or good. So there is some momentum for him on the economic side. The other areas are problematic for him, and I think he'd be much in a much stronger position to focus on the economy. Look, in the modern era, the State of the Union speech is 48 minutes and 33 seconds on average. The standard strategy is to focus on one core theme, hit your key points early, and pound home your 2 to 3 talking points that you expect to be repeated on the news the next day. It sounds like this speech is going to meander a bit into a number of areas, national security, immigration. I'm not sure that's the smartest thing. I think a wiser strategic path would be to focus heavily just on the economy and on infrastructure.
Robert, what about the accusation that his worst enemy is himself, in that last year he gave this address and then the next day he was tweeting, and all the goodwill from the address, a lot of people saying he was presidential, all of it evaporated. What about that issue and the urge to tweet?
Yes, the president has, in the modern era, a singular advantage because he can speak with a singular voice. In communications, and especially in political communications, we talk about message discipline, the ability to repeat the same message over and over again and communicate in a broad and deep way to your target audience. Unfortunately, I think this president has a different strategy for him, and he tries to use Twitter, et cetera, to sort of dominate the news cycle, and that, I think, has had mixed effect. An interesting question would be, if this president had much more message discipline and had honed what he said in a much tighter way, would he be more effective in the last year? I think the answer is probably yes.
There's Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders awaiting the address. Einer, China approach. Let's talk a little bit about that, the Chinese policy. You know, he's backed away from currency manipulator, but now seems poised to kind of launch a trade war with these tariffs that he's just imposed in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, it does definitely seem that. Expect in this particular speech for him to start talking about respect and how America is going to get back on top and how they're not going to be taken advantage of anymore. He's portrayed the U.S. as a victim of WTO, and he's going to be the Superman who puts an end to it. I don't know that this will end well.
And as you speak, Melania Trump, the First Lady, now making her way to her perch high above, and she'll be greeting some of the people who will be mentioned in the speech. That's a tradition dating back to Ronald Reagan, where he cites the people in the box next to the First Lady and kind of tells their stories, these heartwarming stories. And saying domestic views of Trump, and more to the point, the stated division in the United States. So Robert talking about his polling numbers, but you're even looking at states like Texas, Gallup out with a new poll showing that he's not even doing well in traditional Republican states like that. I think he's at about 40%.
Well, in those states, he,
Here
you know,
comes the
has
cabinet.
made...
Let me just interrupt you for a second as we look at the cabinet entering as we speak. Shaking hands, the president not far behind. One would suspect there's Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, Steve Mnuchin, the Secretary of the Treasury, right behind him. Blue suits in abundance tonight, as well as red ties. Last year, when he gave his speech, the president was wearing a blue tie, and so was Mike Pence and the speaker as well. But I think there's going to be some variation tonight. But go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, I was just saying that he's not a traditional Republican, so it's not unusual that he would have isolated himself from many members of the party and traditional supporters of the Republican Party, like those who live in Texas and in some of the traditional Republican states or red states. So, you know, he's his own person. He has his agenda. And his base, as you stated earlier, is very specific. And I think when you focus so much on your base, you tend to isolate a lot of people who may be moderate Republicans, who may be fiscal conservatives, but, you know, a little bit more socially liberal. So, you know, with the way that he carries on his business, it's not surprising that he would isolate even Republicans in states that are traditionally Republican.
We're looking at Ben Carson. I just want quickly, if you will, he's really the only African American in this cabinet. What does that say to you?
It says what I said earlier, that he does not take black people seriously, because he would put a brain surgeon in the role that he has placed Ben Carson in, Dr. Ben Carson in, instead of finding one of the many black PhDs or policy people or folks who have dedicated their lives to studying urban planning and housing and things of that nature, and possibly putting them in that position because they would be more qualified than Dr. Ben Carson. So it says to me that he does not take black people seriously, he does not take our issues seriously, and he does not, and then that is reflected in the black people that he does employ in these positions of power.
All right, thanks so much for your observations. Nathan King is there at the U.S. Capitol. Give us a scene setter, if you will, Nathan.
Yeah, well, it's all happening. The hall nearly filled. Of course, that is the House of Representatives hall. We're seeing Nikki Haley, the UN ambassador for the United States, a real high flyer in the Trump administration, taking her seat. We've seen the rest of the cabinet come in. There will not be any empty seats. I can tell you there are about 450 seats in the House chamber. But remember, you've got to bring in all the Senate. You've got to bring in the judges, the military. And in the gallery around the top that you can see now, where the First Lady is sitting with the guests, there's about 600 seats, but they're actually allowing about 150 to 200 people standing. So it's going to be really, really packed in there. You can see a lot of glad handing, a lot of shaking hands. There's Jeff Sessions, the embattled Attorney General. This is a chance for a lot of senators and congressmen to get a handshake with the president, to get themselves on TV. So you'll see a lot of posturing as Donald Trump walks in. No matter what his status in the polls, he's still President of the United States. There'll also be lots of motioning to the gallery that we're looking at now, where First Lady Melania Trump is. You can see she's flanked by a first responder. There are basically personifications of policy up there next to her. There are people up there that represent what the Trump administration want to do or care about. For example, there's a police officer who the Trump administration are backing very strongly, who actually adopted the son of opioid people who overdosed and died. They say they're very concerned about opioid addiction as well. So that's going to symbolize and personify for the American people. On the Democratic side, they've invited dreamers, these hundreds of thousands that we were talking about who came here illegally through no fault of their own, brought as children by their parents. So there is these issues that will be played out, and in the speech you will see the cameras flick to these people when these issues are mentioned. They may even be addressed by President Trump in the speech as well. So we are awaiting the U.S. President of the United States. He will be in the hall momentarily.
Yes. And interestingly enough, Sean's here on the set with us. He talked about this police officer there, and he's going to talk about the opioid. You know it firsthand. You were in West Virginia. What do you think those people want to hear from the president?
Well, I think a lot of them are very frustrated because they wanted President Trump to designate the United States in a national crisis over the opioid epidemic. Instead, he just called it a health crisis. And while that gives it a certain degree of notoriety, it doesn't provide money for funding, for treatment, for dealing with this that has just crippled so many parts of the United States. And the guest of the First Lady is actually a police officer who got to know a woman who was an opioid addict. And when she had her child, that officer and his wife adopted the child. So they're going to be singled out tonight. It's going to be interesting to hear what Trump has to say about dealing with this ongoing epidemic in terms of touting this wonderful work by officers. So a lot to really focus on.
Let's listen in.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
You see Kevin McCarthy, one of the House leaders on the Republican side, right behind the President of the United States as they make their way in, glad handing, a lot of handshaking. It's interesting, Sean, I want to ask you about this because we were given excerpts from his speech, and at some point during the speech he's going to say, "This is our new American moment. There has never been a better time to start living the American dream." What a contrast from American carnage, what we heard in his inaugural address. Talk to me about that.
Well, I think we have to look back at the people in his inner circle at that time. Of course, Steve Bannon, somebody really connected very closely with the right, which some people call the alt-right in the United States. And it was Bannon and that close group of advisors that really made him trumpet the fact that you have to make America first. America first, talking about the American carnage. And I want to talk about what he said before American carnage. He said, for too many of our citizens, a different reality exists in terms about economic benefits. Mothers and children trapped in poverty in our inner cities, rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation, an educational system flush with cash but leaves our young and beautiful students deprived of knowledge, and the crime and gangs and drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. Well, the reality is crime had been down dramatically in the United States. A lot of people were going through economic upheaval. So which Trump are we going to see tonight? The one that's going to put an olive branch out there and reach across the aisle and try to find a way to move forward, or one who's going to dig in his heels and say, America first again?
He just shook hands with Justice Breyer, Chief Justice John Roberts there as well. And Nathan, we're also going to hear about the DPRK, I suspect. What do we expect to hear there?
Yeah, from the excerpts from the White House that they released, they're basically going to say that times of basically carelessness and not paying attention have actually led to costs and aggression around the world. That if you ignore the DPRK's growing nuclear and ballistic missile threat, then they will lead to more aggression. That is going to be a repeat, if not in the same Rocket Man language that we heard in the UN last September. It's going to be a repeat of this very different stance from the strategic patience of the Obama administration, just as, of course, North Korea, the DPRK, and Seoul have come together for these Winter Olympics. It's going to be very interesting to see. Also, by the way, we are hearing in breaking news tonight that the Korean ambassador-to-be, Victor Cha, has been withdrawn from nomination. He will not be the new ambassador to Seoul over differences about potentially striking the DPRK in some sort of punitive measure. So that is really going to be the focus of our attention as well as we look not just here at this speech at the State of the Union here in Washington, but around the world and focusing on the Korean Peninsula. If indeed the US is still thinking about some sort of punitive attack on Pyongyang, then we'll be looking in this speech for clues about whether the president is ready to do that.
And the U.S. president there now, he will be addressing this group in a short period of time, but as you can see, he's basking in this moment as he stands behind the lectern, he himself applauding at times, getting quite a round of applause here, which is traditional. This, again, his first State of the Union address. So we will be listening in to see what themes he'll be hitting on. Obviously, he'll be talking about the biggest tax cuts and reform in American history. That's how he describes it. Let's listen in.
Members of Congress, I have the high privilege and the distinct honor of presenting to you the President of the United States.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Vice President, members of Congress, the First Lady of the United States, and my fellow Americans. Less than 1 year has passed since I first stood at this podium in this majestic chamber to speak on behalf of the American people and to address their concerns, their hopes, and their dreams. That night, our new administration had already taken very swift action. A new tide of optimism was already sweeping across our land. Each day since, we have gone forward with a clear vision and a righteous mission to make America great again for all Americans. Over the last year, we have made incredible progress and achieved extraordinary success. We have faced challenges we expected and others we could never have imagined. We have shared in the heights of victory and the pains of hardship. We have endured floods and fires and storms. But through it all, we have seen the beauty of America's soul and the steel in America's spine. Each test has forged new American heroes to remind us who we are and show us what we can be. We saw the volunteers of the Cajun Navy racing to the rescue with their fishing boats to save people in the aftermath of a totally devastating hurricane. We saw strangers shielding strangers from a hail of gunfire on the Las Vegas Strip. We heard tales of Americans like Coast Guard Petty Officer Ashley Leopard, who is here tonight in the gallery with Melania. Ashley was aboard one of the first helicopters on the scene in Houston during the Hurricane Harvey. Through 18 hours of wind and rain, Ashley braved live power lines and deep water to help save more than 40 lives. Ashley, we all thank you. Thank you very much. We heard about Americans like firefighter David Dahlberg. He's here with us also. David faced down walls of flame to rescue almost 60 children trapped at a California summer camp threatened by those devastating wildfires. To everyone still recovering in Texas, Florida, Louisiana, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, everywhere, we are with you. We love you, and we always will pull through together, always. Thank you to David and the brave people of California. Thank you very much, David. Great job. Some trials over the past year touched this chamber very personally. With us tonight is one of the toughest people ever to serve in this House, a guy who took a bullet, almost died, and was back to work 3.5 months later, the legend from Louisiana, Congressman Steve Scalise. I think they like you, Steve. We're incredibly grateful for the heroic efforts of the Capitol Police officers, the Alexandria Police, and the doctors, nurses, and paramedics who saved his life and the lives of many others, some in this room. In the aftermath, yes. In the aftermath of that terrible shooting, we came together, not as Republicans or Democrats, but as representatives of the people. But it is not enough to come together only in times of tragedy. Tonight, I call upon all of us to set aside our differences, to seek out common ground, and to summon the unity we need to deliver for the people. This is really the key. These are the people we were elected to serve. Thank you. Over the last year, the world has seen what we always knew, that no people on earth are so fearless or daring or determined as Americans. If there is a mountain, we climb it. If there's a frontier, we cross it. If there's a challenge, we tame it. If there's an opportunity, we seize it. So let's begin tonight by recognizing that the state of our union is strong because our people are strong. And together we are building a safe, strong, and proud America. Since the election, we have created 2.4 million new jobs, including 200,000 new jobs in manufacturing alone. Tremendous numbers. After years and years of wage stagnation, we are finally seeing rising wages. Unemployment claims have hit a 45-year low. And something I'm very proud of, African American unemployment stands at the lowest rate ever recorded. And Hispanic American unemployment has also reached the lowest levels in history. Small business confidence is at an all-time high. The stock market has smashed one record after another, gaining $8 trillion and more in value in just this short period of time. The great news for Americans, 401k, retirement pension, and college savings accounts have gone through the roof. And just as I promised the American people from this podium 11 months ago, we enacted the biggest tax cuts and reforms in American history. Our massive tax cuts provide tremendous relief for the middle class and small business. To lower tax rates for hardworking Americans, we nearly doubled the standard deduction for everyone. Now the first $24,000 earned by a married couple is completely tax-free. We also doubled the child tax credit. A typical family of four making $75,000 will see their tax bill reduced by $2,000, slashing their tax bill in half. In April, this will be the last time you will ever file under the old and very broken system, and millions of Americans will have more take-home pay starting next month, a lot more. We eliminated an especially cruel tax that fell mostly on Americans making less than $50,000 a year, forcing them to pay tremendous penalties simply because they couldn't afford government-ordered health plans. We repealed the core of the disastrous Obamacare. The individual mandate is now gone. Thank you. We slashed the business tax rate from 35% all the way down to 21%, so American companies can compete and win against anyone else anywhere in the world. These changes alone are estimated to increase average family income by more than $4,000. A lot of money. Small businesses have also received a massive tax cut and can now deduct 20% of their business income. Here tonight are Steve Staub and Sandy Keplinger of Staub Manufacturing, a small, beautiful business in Ohio. They've just finished the best year in their 20-year history. Because of tax reform, they are handing out raises, hiring an additional 14 people, and expanding into the building next door. Good feeling. One of Staub's employees, Corey Adams, is also with us tonight. Corey is an all-American worker. He supported himself through high school, lost his job during the 2008 recession, and was later hired by Staub, where he trained to become a welder. Like many hardworking Americans, Corey plans to invest his tax cut raise into his new home and his two daughters' education. Corey, please stand. and he's a great welder. I was told that by the man that owns that company that's doing so well. So congratulations, Corey. Since we passed tax cuts, roughly 3 million workers have already gotten tax cut bonuses, many of them thousands and thousands of dollars per worker, and it's getting more every month, every week. Apple has just announced it plans to invest a total of $350 billion in America and hire another 20,000 workers. And just a little while ago, ExxonMobil announced a $50 billion investment in the United States. Just a little while ago. This, in fact, is our new American moment. There has never been a better time to start living the American dream. So to every citizen watching at home tonight, no matter where you've been or where you've come from, this is your time. If you work hard, if you believe in yourself, if you believe in America, then you can dream anything. You can be anything. And together, we can achieve absolutely anything. Tonight, I want to talk about what kind of future we're going to have and what kind of a nation we're going to be. All of us together as one team, one people, and one American family can do anything. We all share the same home, the same heart, the same destiny, and the same great American flag. Together, we are rediscovering the American way. In America, we know that faith and family, not government and bureaucracy, are the center of American life. The motto is, "In God we trust." And we celebrate our police, our military, and our amazing veterans as heroes who deserve our total and unwavering support. Here tonight is Preston Sharp, a 12-year-old boy from Redding, California, who noticed that veterans' graves were not marked with flags on Veterans Day. He decided all by himself to change that and started a movement that has now placed 40,000 flags at the graves of our great heroes. Preston, a job well done. Young patriots like Preston teach all of us about our civic duty as Americans. And I met Preston a little while ago, and he is something very special that I can tell you. Great future. Thank you very much for all you've done, Preston. Thank you very much. Preston's reverence for those who have served our nation reminds us of why we salute our flag, why we put our hands on our hearts for the Pledge of Allegiance, and why we proudly stand for the national anthem. Americans love their country, and they deserve a government that shows them the same love and loyalty in return. For the last year, we have sought to restore the bonds of trust between our citizens and their government. Working with the Senate, we are appointing judges who will interpret the Constitution as written, including a great new Supreme Court justice and more circuit court judges than any new administration in the history of our country. We are totally defending our Second Amendment and have taken historic actions to protect religious liberty. And we are serving our brave veterans, including giving our veterans choice in their health care decisions. Last year, Congress also passed, and I signed, the landmark VA Accountability Act. Since its passage, my administration has already removed more than 1,500 VA employees who failed to give our veterans the care they deserve. And we are hiring talented people who love our vets as much as we do. And I will not stop until our veterans are properly taken care of, which has been my promise to them from the very beginning of this great journey. All Americans deserve accountability and respect, and that's what we are giving to our wonderful heroes, our veterans. Thank you. So tonight I call on Congress to empower every cabinet secretary with the authority to reward good workers and to remove federal employees who undermine the public trust or fail the American people. In our drive to make Washington accountable, we have eliminated more regulations in our first year than any administration in the history of our country. We have ended the war on American energy, and we have ended the war on beautiful, clean coal. We are now very proudly an exporter of energy to the world. In Detroit, I halted government mandates that crippled America's great, beautiful auto workers so that we can get Motor City revving its engines again, and that's what's happening. Many car companies are now building and expanding plants in the United States, something we haven't seen for decades. Chrysler is moving a major plant from Mexico to Michigan. Toyota and Mazda are opening up a plant in Alabama, a big one, and we haven't seen this in a long time. It's all coming back. Very soon, auto plants and other plants will be opening up all over our country. This is all news Americans are totally unaccustomed to hearing. For many years, companies and jobs were only leaving us. But now, they are roaring back, they're coming back. They want to be where the action is. They want to be in the United States of America. That's where they want to be. Exciting progress is happening every single day. To speed access to breakthrough cures and affordable generic drugs, last year, the FDA approved more new and generic drugs and medical devices than ever before in our country's history. We also believe that patients with terminal conditions, terminal illness, should have access to experimental treatment immediately that could potentially save their lives. People who are terminally ill should not have to go from country to seek a cure. I want to give them a chance right here at home. It's time for Congress to give these wonderful, incredible Americans the right to try. One of my greatest priorities is to reduce the price of prescription drugs. In many other countries, these drugs cost far less than what we pay in the United States, and it's very, very unfair. That is why I've directed my administration to make fixing the injustice of high drug prices one of my top priorities for the year. and prices will come down substantially. Watch. America has also finally turned the page on decades of unfair trade deals that sacrificed our prosperity and shipped away our companies, our jobs, and our wealth. Our nation has lost its wealth, but we're getting it back so fast. The era of economic surrender is totally over. From now on, we expect trading relationships to be fair and, very importantly, reciprocal. We will work to fix bad trade deals and negotiate new ones, and they'll be good ones, but they'll be fair. And we will protect American workers and American intellectual property through strong enforcement of our trade rules. As we rebuild our industries, it is also time to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. America is a nation of builders. We built the Empire State Building in just 1 year. Isn't it a disgrace that it can now take 10 years just to get a minor permit approved for the building of a simple road? I am asking both parties to come together to give us safe, fast, reliable, and modern infrastructure that our economy needs and our people deserve. Tonight, I'm calling on Congress to produce a bill that generates at least $1.5 trillion for the new infrastructure investment that our country so desperately needs. Every federal dollar should be leveraged by partnering with state and local governments and, where appropriate, tapping into private sector investment to permanently fix the infrastructure deficit, and we can do it. Any bill must also streamline the permitting and approval process, getting it down to no more than 2 years and perhaps even 1. Together, we can reclaim our great building heritage. We will build gleaming new roads, bridges, highways, railways, and waterways all across our land. And we will do it with American heart, American hands, and American grit. We want every American to know the dignity of a hard day's work. We want every child to be safe in their home at night. And we want every citizen to be proud of this land that we all love so much. We can lift our citizens from welfare to work, from dependence to independence, and from poverty to prosperity. As tax cuts create new jobs. Let's invest in workforce development, and let's invest in job training, which we need so badly. Let's open great vocational schools so our future workers can learn a craft and realize their full potential. And let's support working families by supporting paid family leave. As America regains its strength, opportunity must be extended to all citizens. That is why this year we will embark on reforming our prisons to help former inmates who have served their time get a second chance at life. Struggling communities, especially immigrant communities, will also be helped by immigration policies that focus on the best interests of American workers and American families. For decades, open borders have allowed drugs and gangs to pour into our most vulnerable communities. They've allowed millions of low-wage workers to compete for jobs and wages against the poorest Americans. Most tragically, they have caused the loss of many innocent lives. Here tonight are two fathers and two mothers, Evelyn Rodriguez, Freddie Cuevas, Elizabeth Alvarado, and Robert Mickens. Their two teenage daughters, Kayla Cuevas and Nisa Mickens, were close friends on Long Island. But in September 2016, on the eve of Nisa's 16th birthday, such a happy time it should have been, neither of them came home. These two precious girls were brutally murdered while walking together in their hometown. 6 members of the savage MS-13 gang have been charged with Kayla and Nisa's murders. Many of these gang members took advantage of glaring loopholes in our laws to enter the country as illegal, unaccompanied, alien minors and wound up in Kayla and Nisa's high school. Evelyn, Elizabeth, Freddie, and Robert, tonight everyone in this chamber is praying for you. Everyone in America is grieving for you. Please stand. Thank you very much. I want you to know that 320 million hearts are right now breaking for you. We love you. Thank you. While we cannot imagine the depths of that kind of sorrow, we can make sure that other families never have to endure this kind of pain. Tonight, I am calling on Congress to finally close the deadly loopholes that have allowed MS-13 and other criminal gangs to break into our country. We have proposed new legislation that will fix our immigration laws and support our ICE and Border Patrol agents. These are great people. These are great, great people that work so hard in the midst of such danger so that this can never happen again. The United States is a compassionate nation. We are proud that we do more than any other country anywhere in the world to help the needy, the struggling, and the underprivileged all over the world. But as President of the United States, my highest loyalty, my greatest compassion, my constant concern is for America's children, America's struggling workers, and America's forgotten communities. I want our youth to grow up, to achieve great things. I want our poor to have their chance to rise. So tonight, I am extending an open hand to work with members of both parties, Democrats and Republicans, to protect our citizens of every background, color, religion, and creed. My duty, and the sacred duty of every elected official in this chamber, is to defend Americans, to protect their safety, their families, their communities, and their right to the American dream. Because Americans are dreamers too. Here tonight is one leader in the effort to defend our country, Homeland Security Investigation Special Agent Celestino Martinez. He goes by DJ and CJ. He said, call me either one. So we'll call you CJ. Served 15 years in the Air Force before becoming an ICE agent and spending the last 15 years fighting gang violence and getting dangerous criminals off of our streets. Tough job. At one point, MS-13 leaders ordered CJ's murder, and they wanted it to happen quickly. But he did not cave to threats or to fear. Last May, he commanded an operation to track down gang members on Long Island. His team has arrested nearly 400, including more than 220 MS-13 gang members. And I have to tell you, what the Border Patrol and ICE have done, we have sent thousands and thousands and thousands of MS-13 horrible people out of this country or into our prisons. So I just want to congratulate you, CJ. You're a brave guy. Thank you very much. And I asked CJ, what's the secret? He said, we're just tougher than they are, and I like that answer. Now let's get Congress to send you, and all of the people in this great chamber have to do it. We have no choice. CJ, we're going to send you reinforcements, and we're going to send them to you quickly. It's what you need. Over the next few weeks, the House and Senate will be voting on an immigration reform package. In recent months, my administration has met extensively with both Democrats and Republicans to craft a bipartisan approach to immigration reform. Based on these discussions, we presented Congress with a detailed proposal that should be supported by both parties as a fair compromise, one where nobody gets everything they want, but where our country gets the critical reforms it needs and must have. Here are the 4 pillars of our plan. The first pillar of our framework generously offers a path to citizenship for 1.8 million illegal immigrants who were brought here by their parents at a young age. That covers almost 3 times more people than the previous administration covered. Under our plan, those who meet education and work requirements and show good moral character will be able to become full citizens of the United States over a 12-year period. The second pillar fully secures the border. That means building a great wall on the southern border, and it means hiring more heroes like CJ to keep our communities safe. Crucially, our plan closes the terrible loopholes exploited by criminals and terrorists to enter our country, and it finally ends the horrible and dangerous practice of catch and release. The third pillar ends the visa lottery, a program that randomly hands out green cards without any regard for skill, merit, or the safety of American people. It's time to begin moving toward a merit-based immigration system, one that admits people who are skilled, who want to work, who will contribute to our society, and who will love and respect our country. The fourth and final pillar protects the nuclear family by ending chain migration. Under the current broken system, a single immigrant can bring in virtually unlimited numbers of distant relatives. Under our plan, we focus on the immediate family by limiting sponsorships to spouses and minor children. This vital reform is necessary not just for our economy, but for our security and for the future of America. In recent weeks, 2 terrorist attacks in New York were made possible by the visa lottery and chain migration. In the age of terrorism, these programs present risks we can just no longer afford. It's time to reform. these outdated immigration rules and finally bring our immigration system into the 21st century. These 4 pillars represent a down-the-middle compromise and one that will create a safe, modern, and lawful immigration system. For over 30 years, Washington has tried and failed to solve this problem. This Congress can be the one that finally makes it happen. Most importantly, these 4 pillars will produce legislation that fulfills my ironclad pledge to sign a bill that puts America first. So let's come together, set politics aside, and finally get the job done. These reforms will also support our response to the terrible crisis of opioid and drug addiction. Never before has it been like it is now. It is terrible. We have to do something about it. In 2016, we lost 64,000 Americans to drug overdoses, 174 deaths per day, 7 per hour. We must get much tougher on drug dealers and pushers if we are going to succeed in stopping this scourge. My administration is committed to fighting the drug epidemic and helping get treatment for those in need, for those who have been so terribly hurt. The struggle will be long and it will be difficult, but as Americans always do, in the end, we will succeed, we will prevail. As we have seen tonight, the most difficult challenges bring out the best in America. We see a vivid expression of this truth in the story of the Holetz family of New Mexico. Ryan Holetz is 27 years old, an officer with the Albuquerque Police Department. He's here tonight with his wife, Rebecca. Thank you, Ryan. Last year, Ryan was on duty when he saw a pregnant, homeless woman preparing to inject heroin. When Ryan told her she was going to harm her unborn child, she began to weep. She told him she didn't know where to turn, but badly wanted a safe home for her baby. In that moment, Ryan said he felt God speak to him. You will do it because you can. He heard those words. He took out a picture of his wife and their 4 kids. Then he went home to tell his wife, Rebecca. In an instant, she agreed to adopt. The Holetz named their new daughter Hope. Ryan and Rebecca, you embody the goodness of our nation. Thank you. Thank you, Ryan and Rebecca. As we rebuild America's strength and confidence at home, we are also restoring our strength and standing abroad. Around the world, we face rogue regimes, terrorist groups, and rivals like China and Russia that challenge our interests, our economy, and our values. In confronting these horrible dangers, we know that weakness is the surest path to conflict, and unmatched power is the surest means to our true and great defense. For this reason, I am asking Congress to end the dangerous defense sequester and fully fund our great military. As part of our defense, we must modernize and rebuild our nuclear arsenal, hopefully never having to use it, but making it so strong and so powerful that it will deter any acts of aggression by any other nation or anyone else. Perhaps someday in the future there will be a magical moment when the countries of the world will get together to eliminate their nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, we are not there yet, sadly. Last year, I also pledged that we would work with our allies to extinguish ISIS from the face of the earth. 1 year later, I am proud to report that the coalition to defeat ISIS has liberated very close to 100% of the territory just recently held by these killers in Iraq and in Syria and in other locations as well. But there is much more work to be done. We will continue our fight until ISIS is defeated. Army Staff Sergeant Justin Peck is here tonight. Near Raqqa last November, Justin and his comrade, Chief Petty Officer Kenton Stacy, were on a mission to clear buildings that ISIS had rigged with explosive, so that civilians could return to that city, hopefully soon and hopefully safely. Clearing the second floor of a vital hospital, Kenton Stacy was severely wounded by an explosion. Immediately, Justin bounded into the booby-trapped and unbelievably dangerous and unsafe building and found Kenton, but in very, very bad shape. He applied pressure to the wound and inserted a tube to reopen an airway. He then performed CPR for 20 straight minutes during the ground transport and maintained artificial respiration through 2.5 hours and through emergency surgery. Kenton Stacy would have died if it were not for Justin's selfless love for his fellow warrior. Tonight, Kenton is recovering in Texas. Raqqa is liberated, and Justin is wearing his new Bronze Star with a V for valor. Staff Sergeant Peck, all of America salutes him. Terrorists who do things like place bombs in civilian hospitals are evil. When possible, we have no choice but to annihilate them. When necessary, we must be able to detain and question them. But we must be clear, terrorists are not merely criminals. They are unlawful enemy combatants. And when captured overseas, they should be treated like the terrorists they are. In the past, we have foolishly released hundreds and hundreds of dangerous terrorists, only to meet them again on the battlefield, including the ISIS leader, al-Baghdadi, who we captured, who we had, who we released. So today, I'm keeping another promise. I just signed, prior to walking in, an order directing Secretary Mattis, who is doing a great job. Thank you. To re-examine our military detention policy and to keep open the detention facilities in Guantanamo Bay. I am asking Congress to ensure that in the fight against ISIS and al-Qaeda, we continue to have all necessary power to detain terrorists wherever we chase them down, wherever we find them. And in many cases, for them, it will now be Guantanamo Bay. At the same time, as of a few months ago, our warriors in Afghanistan have new rules of engagement. Along with their heroic Afghan partners, our military is no longer undermined by artificial timelines, and we no longer tell our enemies our plans. Last month, I also took an action endorsed unanimously by the U.S. Senate just months before. I recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Shortly afterwards, dozens of countries voted in the United Nations General Assembly against America's sovereign right to make this decision. In 2016, American taxpayers generously sent those same countries more than $20 billion in aid. That is why tonight I am asking Congress to pass legislation to help ensure American foreign assistance dollars always serve American interests and only go to friends of America, not enemies of America. As we strengthen friendships all around the world, we are also restoring clarity about our adversaries. When the people of Iran rose up against the crimes of their corrupt dictatorship, I did not stay silent. America stands with the people of Iran in their courageous struggle for freedom. I am asking Congress to address the fundamental flaws in the terrible Iran nuclear deal. My administration has also imposed tough sanctions on the communist and socialist dictatorships in Cuba and Venezuela. But no regime has oppressed its own citizens more totally or brutally than the cruel dictatorship in North Korea. North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear missiles could very soon threaten our homeland. We are waging a campaign of maximum pressure to prevent that from ever happening. Past experience has taught us that complacency and concessions only invite aggression and provocation. I will not repeat the mistakes of past administrations that got us into this very dangerous position. We need only look at the depraved character of the North Korean regime to understand the nature of the nuclear threat it could pose to America and to our allies. Otto Warmbier was a hard-working student at the University of Virginia, and a great student he was. On his way to study abroad in Asia, Otto joined a tour to North Korea. At its conclusion, this wonderful young man was arrested and charged with crimes against the state. After a shameful trial, the dictatorship sentenced Otto to 15 years of hard labor before returning him to America last June, horribly injured and on the verge of death. He passed away just days after his return. Otto's wonderful parents, Fred and Cindy Warmbier, are here with us tonight, along with Otto's brother and sister, Austin and Greta. Please. Incredible people. You are powerful witnesses to a menace that threatens our world, and your strength truly inspires us all. Thank you very much. Thank you. Tonight, we pledge to honor Otto's memory with total American resolve. Thank you. Finally, we are joined by one more witness to the ominous nature of this regime. His name is Mr. Ji Sung Ho. In 1996, Sung Ho was a starving boy in North Korea. One day he tried to steal coal from a railroad car to barter for a few scraps of food, which were very hard to get. In the process, he passed out on the train tracks, exhausted from hunger. He woke up as a train ran over his limbs. He then endured multiple amputations without anything to dull the pain or the hurt. His brother and sister gave what little food they had to help him recover and ate dirt themselves, permanently stunting their own growth. Later, he was tortured by North Korean authorities after returning from a brief visit to China. His tormentors wanted to know if he'd met any Christians. He had, and he resolved after that to be free. Sung Ho traveled thousands of miles on crutches all across China and Southeast Asia to freedom. Most of his family followed. His father was caught trying to escape and was tortured to death. Today, he lives in Seoul, where he rescues other defectors and broadcasts into North Korea what the regime fears most: the truth. Today, he has a new leg, but Sung Ho, I understand you still keep those old crutches as a reminder of how far you've come. Your great sacrifice is an inspiration to us all. Please, thank you. Sung Ho's story is a testament to the yearning of every human soul to live in freedom. It was that same yearning for freedom that nearly 250 years ago gave birth to a special place called America. It was a small cluster of colonies caught between a great ocean and a vast wilderness. It was home to an incredible people with a revolutionary idea that they could rule themselves, that they could chart their own destiny, and that together they could light up the entire world. That is what our country has always been about. That is what Americans have always stood for, always strived for, and always done. Atop the dome of this Capitol stands the Statue of Freedom. She stands tall and dignified among the monuments to our ancestors who fought and lived and died to protect her. Monuments to Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln and King. Memorials to the heroes of Yorktown and Saratoga, to young Americans who shed their blood on the shores of Normandy and the fields beyond, and others who went down in the waters of the Pacific and the skies all over Asia. And freedom stands tall over one more monument, this one. This Capitol, this living monument, this is the monument to the American people. We're a people whose heroes live not only in the past, but all around us, defending hope, pride, and defending the American way. They work in every trade. They sacrifice to raise a family. They care for our children at home. They defend our flag abroad. And they are strong moms and brave kids. They are firefighters and police officers and border agents, medics and Marines. But above all else, they are Americans. And this capital, this city, this nation belongs entirely to them. Our task is to respect them, to listen to them, to serve them, to protect them, and to always be worthy of them. Americans fill the world with art and music. They push the bounds of science and discovery, and they forever remind us of what we should never, ever forget. The people dreamed this country. The people built this country. And it's the people who are making America great again. As long as we are proud of who we are and what we are fighting for, there is nothing we cannot achieve. As long as we have confidence in our values, faith in our citizens, and trust in our God, we will never fail. Our families will thrive. Our people will prosper. And our nation will forever be safe and strong and proud and mighty and free. Thank you, and God bless America. Good night.
Well, certainly a nationalistic tenor to the end of this speech with the chanting of USA, although as we saw him interrupted periodically by extended applause, we also saw a lot of members from the Democratic Party sitting on their hands. The first State of the Union address from President Donald Trump. He'll now make his way out of the gallery, shake hands again as he makes his way out. Mostly domestic issues, pretty much the focus of the speech, touting his efforts to remove regulations, also talking about the tax cuts, how that's unleashed a great deal of money and energy in the, basically the economic sector, said jobs are returning to the United States. He also called for bipartisanship, mentioned he would extend an open hand, wanting to work with the other party, but again, he's had his difficulties doing that in the first year in office. Also talking about infrastructure, opioid crisis. Didn't really have a lot of definitive answers there. Did hit on some foreign issues as well, talking about what he sees as the flawed Iran nuclear deal. He also mentioned Cuba, Venezuela, China, Russia, and most of his stinging words coming at the DPRK. There he's shaking hands with Neil Gorsuch, who was, of course, his nominee to sit on the Supreme Court and was approved in his first year in office. So again, most of the end of the speech actually focusing on the DPRK. And there he's talking to his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. Jack Barton's in Seoul. Jack, I want to get your thoughts on what he had to say about the DPRK. Of course, we've seen this kind of thawing in relations between Seoul and Pyongyang. Talk to me about how this might be received on the Korean Peninsula.
Well, if there was any doubt about where the DPRK and its nuclear and missile programs sit in President Trump's agenda, this certainly cleared it up. He appeared to spend as much time, if not more, speaking about that issue than all of the other foreign policy issues wrapped together that he mentioned in the State of the Union address. So clearly it is the top priority. Also, some very strong wording there. Alternately calling the administration of Kim Jong-un a cruel dictatorship or a depraved regime, but no mention of Kim Jong-un himself. There was no talk of Rocket Man. So that was a little bit different. Now, again, he talked a lot about Otto Warmbier, which is something he often does when he speaks to a domestic audience, bringing it home to Americans, the tragic story of this young man who was arrested for allegedly stealing a propaganda poster in a hotel as he was preparing to leave the DPRK, returned to the United States in an unconscious state, dying soon after. But he also talked about Ji Song-ho, a North Korean defector who now works here in the South. Again, another tragic story, but bringing it home what life is like in the DPRK. Now, having said all of that, again, he didn't mention Kim Jong-un. There was no talk of Rocket Man. There was no fire and fury. There was no direct threat. So it was a very strong speech talking about not making the mistakes of the past administrations again, but there was no direct threats as well. So as you say, actually it was a bit toned down. It could because the Winter Olympics are coming. We have seen, the war games suspended. Today, a southern team is heading to the north. It will return with northern athletes. That in itself probably breaks sanctions. There were discussions with Washington into the evening whether that's okay. So there is this, this period of calming the tensions. It's clearly reflected in the speech. Whether that will last after the Olympic Games is over, of course, we're going to have to wait and see. But even though it was very strong in it, and it was clearly a top priority, it was a much more measured, a much more toned down stance on the DPRK that the president took.
Yeah, and he mentioned that the young man's sacrifice and inspiration to all of us. He, of course, held up his crutches. He said he's a testament to the yearning of every human soul to live in freedom, and then kind of moved on from there. As you said, not really the kind of negative rhetoric that we've heard in the past with Rocket Man and that sort of thing. But I have to ask you, were there jitters there on the peninsula before this speech? Because he is rather unpredictable when it comes to his rhetoric.
Yeah, he is rather unpredictable. But it's interesting that here in South Korea as well, there is something of a backlash growing against even President Moon Jae-in's handling of, the way the Olympics has been carried through. Many people here thinking actually that the president has been rushing ahead too quickly with this mood of détente, making too many concessions to the DPRK. We're even seeing amongst 20 to 30-year-old Koreans a sort of a backlash growing. The president's popularity at an all-time low since his election, and it's all to do with this issue of the Olympics. So there wasn't really a case of jitters. People were waiting to see what President Trump had to say. Of course, you don't want to hear that same rhetoric again that causes confusion. That has been the main complaint here. Not really that the U.S. policy is too hard-line, but that it is too disjointed. There are too often very different messages coming from President Trump or Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. What people here have really been wanting to hear is a unified message coming from the United States. But increasingly, we're seeing they're perhaps a little bit more in line with that conservative rhetoric. So, the speech today given by President Trump would have no doubt reassured many people. It was strong, yet it was toned down, it was statesmanlike, and it really didn't add to any of the existing pressures, but in many ways gave a more unified message or a unified position on where the United States stands.
Jack Barton joining us from Seoul. Thanks so much. As we see the President of the United States exiting the chamber there. One of the other things he talked about was China and Russia. Let's listen in to a brief portion of the speech.
Around the world, we face rogue regimes, terrorist groups, and rivals like China and Russia that challenge our interests, our economy, and our values. In confronting these horrible dangers, we know that weakness is the surest path to conflict, and unmatched power is the surest means to our true and great defense.
I want to invite Einar Tangent into the conversation. He's in Beijing. Einar, it was interesting. Sean and I were sitting here on the set. We were following the draft of this speech. He did ad-lib in spots. He was supposed to say in confronting these dangers. Instead, he said in confronting these horrible dangers. And he kind of went on to say we need a true and great defense instead of our defense. Kind of strong words towards China. How do you think it's going to go over there in Beijing?
Well, I don't think that it'll go over very well, but I think Beijing is looking for what type of actions he's going to take. His statement is pretty much in line with the new strategic policy that was put out that has identified both Russia and China as competitors in all the things that he said. His ad lib indicates that he's still intent on trying to push China. If you notice, it was very, very light on trade. International trade. It was very, very light on China and what he intends to do there. No mention of chorus or NAFTA or any of the other issues that are there. So I think Beijing will be puzzling a little bit over this, but I think they'll see it mainly as a kind of emotional appeal to the people of the United States to kind of get in line behind him at a time when he is actually very unpopular.
And it's interesting, Sean, just to invite you into the conversation. He described China and Russia as rivals, and yet the Obama administration used to say there were areas where we compete, areas where we cooperate. They always made that distinction. He didn't.
He did not here. And it's also kind of a move away from things he has done in the past. If you think about the first time they met in Mar-a-Lago, and then when he was greeted at the state welcome in Beijing, he talked about forging a friendship with President Xi Jinping. But in an hour and 20-minute address that was interrupted by applause well over 100 times, China was only mentioned one time. President Xi was not mentioned at all. They did talk about the rivals being the competitors and the fact that this was spelled out in their defense plan back in December. But I thought it was interesting, not using the word China, they talked about any kind of trade deal moving forward, saying we're going to work to fix bad trade deals and negotiate new ones.
Actually, why don't you stop? Let's listen to what he said about that and we can talk about it.
We will work to fix bad trade deals and negotiate new ones, and they'll be good ones, but they'll be fair. And we will protect American workers and American intellectual property through strong enforcement of our trade rules.
Einar, I want to ask you about that because obviously with the tariffs just imposed on China, he's really putting this out there that, I've got to protect these American workers, America first. Where's this going to go, do you think?
Well, that was the emotional part of his appeal, but what he's really saying is that he's dedicated to bilateral treaties. He's moving away from any kind of group like the WTO, the United Nations, Climate Accord. This is pretty much in line with everything that he's stated to date. He's just putting it out there very clearly that he's going to start his own way. Now, surprisingly, he did not indicate he was about to start a trade war, which people have been expecting. I think there is some effort on his side to calm things down, but tomorrow and the day after, he'll be confronting this 301 inquiry, which he requested, that the United States Trade Representative is going to come down squarely against China. The question is, what is he going to do about it? And will this be the first warning shot in a trade war that goes tit for tat between Beijing and Washington?
And it's interesting, Sean, we talk a lot about trade. He talks a lot about trade. It's got to be fair. He wants just these small deals. Didn't want to be a part of the TPP, and yet you see Canada staying in it. You see Canada and Mexico kind of veering in different directions because they don't know how reliable the U.S. is as a business partner now. You see Theresa May starting a trip to China right now. You're seeing a lot of these other countries looking elsewhere, and of course China, one of those places they're looking to.
The big question is the U.S. going to remain alone? Are they going to find a way to work in this globalization? And you talked about how important this is. in terms of a trade deal, there's $645 billion in the last numbers available traded between China and the United States, with the U.S. having a deficit of about $300 billion. But if you start this trade war, it's the kind of thing that can really have an awful ripple effect in the United States. If you think about the companies in the United States that depend on trade with China for their inventory, and also those companies that have investment in China and are operating there as well, Mike. So if he does get into this tit for tat, it's one thing for him to say, oh, these awful trade practices have just crippled our economy and sent our jobs overwhere. But I think overseas, I think what we're going to deal with in the coming hours and days after this address, the State of the Union, are people picking it apart and saying, he was only half telling the truth here. This isn't the full story. And I think that's what we're going to hear a lot about coming out of this, because China and the United States have to find a way to work together. The two largest economies on Earth, so much at stake. And if the U.S. continues to just build walls around itself, both physically and in a diplomatic fashion, where are they going to be as the TPP goes under and there's this huge vacuum? China can move in and develop trade with areas in Asia and areas throughout Europe as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned walls, so that is a perfect segue to our next conversation. Frank Contreras standing by in Mexico. Of course, he talked a lot about immigration here and his 4 pillars. How do you think that's going to be received there?
Well, Mexicans are certainly watching that issue very carefully, Mike, and they were listening very carefully to see just how many times the word Mexico was mentioned. It was only mentioned once, and the analysts that we were speaking with tonight, observers here in Mexico City, thought that the U.S. president was actually quite light on their country. It has been a target of many attacks by the U.S. president. The president did, however, call once again for a secure border. He said that meant the building of a Great Wall. He did not mention that he would force Mexico or ask Mexico to pay for that border wall. And so that probably would come as some relief. He also did not mention the North American Free Trade Agreement, did not mention the actual fact that negotiations are underway, the next round taking place at the end of February here in Mexico. And there was one mention of Mexico, as I said, Mike. It was that mention of the Chrysler factory moving from Mexico to Michigan. He did say that the end of economic surrender, the era of economic surrender is now over. That seemed to be a reference to trade pacts such as the North American Free Trade Agreement. But the big issue, of course, that Mexicans watched, Mike, is this question of immigration. The U.S. president called for a 4-pillar project here. One, creating a path for citizenship for those children who are brought into the United States as undocumented immigrants by their parents. And that's quite unusual. He said that he would offer more paths to citizenships for them than the previous administration under President Barack Obama. He called for a secure border, again, to build a Great Wall, as Mr. Trump mentioned tonight. He asked for the end of the visa lottery system in the United States and the end of this thing called chain migration, where migrants are allowed to bring family members, distant family members, into the United States under that system. So Mexicans watching very carefully and watching also words towards Cuba and Venezuela. Said he'll send sanctions to dictatorships in those 2 countries, Mike.
Yeah, you mentioned that Chrysler plant. Already the fact-checking coming in. They are going to invest $1 billion in a factory in Michigan, but that was in the works even before Donald Trump was elected president. Let's listen to a little bit of his speech, and then we'll dive in and have a little bit more conversation.
Under the current broken system, a single immigrant can bring in virtually unlimited numbers of distant relatives. Under our plan, we focus on the immediate family by limiting sponsorships to spouses and minor children. This vital reform is necessary not just for our economy, but for our security and for the future of America.
Massachusetts Representative Joe Kennedy is talking about that right now. Let's listen in.
But today, ladies and gentlemen, today, that promise is being broken by an administration that callously appraises our worthiness and decides who makes the cut and who can be bargained away. They're turning American life into a zero-sum game where for one to win, another must lose, where we can guarantee America's safety if we slash our safety net, where we can extend health care in Mississippi if we gut it in Massachusetts. We can cut taxes for corporations today if we raise them on families tomorrow, where we can take care of sick kids if we sacrifice dreamers. We are bombarded with one false choice after another: coal miners or single moms, rural communities or inner cities, the coast or the heartland. As if the mechanic in Pittsburgh, a teacher in Tulsa, and a daycare worker in Birmingham are bitter rivals, rather than mutual casualties of a system forcefully rigged towards those at the top. As if the parent who lies awake terrified that their transgender son or daughter will be beaten and bullied at school is any more or less legitimate than a parent whose heart is shattered by a daughter in the grips of an opioid addiction. So here is the answer that Democrats offer tonight. We choose both.
That is the grandnephew of the 35th President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. He is also the grandson of Senator Robert Kennedy, both assassinated. Bobby Kennedy, of course, assassinated back in 1968, about 50 years ago. Let's continue the conversation about immigration. We're hearing the Democrats' response to the U.S. president on this issue. Again, he kind of got into the chain migration issue in his comments during the speech. And you heard Kennedy's comments on this. So you've got two different takes here in the U.S. How's this thing going to settle, do you think?
Well, from Mexico, people are paying special attention, Mike, to this whole issue of merit-based immigration. What exactly does that mean? And some people are worried in Latin America and throughout the world, in fact, Africa, Asia, these continents, that might have something to do with people's skin color. There is concern of that around the world in the so-called developing world. So people will be keeping a very close eye on that. Also, the issue of whether or not those gangs, the president referred several times to the MS-13 gangs. Latin Americans like to point out those gangs were actually born in the neighborhoods of Los Angeles, and they were deported back to Central America and then made their way toward the United States. And so they talk about a revolving door here, the drug issue and violent issues inside U.S. cities that create some of these problems with MS-13, Mike.
Frank Contreras joining us from Mexico City. Thanks so much. Let's go to Nitza Soledad Perez. She's in southern Florida. She's been watching the speech with Trump supporters. Give us your gauge on their reaction.
Mike, the crowd here was energized during the hour and 20 minutes that President Trump spoke. The cheers got really, really loud when President Trump talked about the end of the mandate for health care and the fact that jobs are coming back to America thanks to his policies. But let's get the reaction from the Trump supporters that were here. I am joined by Aida Sayas. She is a vice president of the Women's Republican Party or Club here in Miami. Aida, what's your take? What do you think about the speech?
It was phenomenal. It was so inspirational. It was hopeful. It was exciting. It was truly the most wonderful speech of a president in my lifetime. And I'm old enough to remember quite a few, and even our beloved President Reagan. That's how wonderful it was.
Was there something in specific that really hit you, that really made you feel proud of electing President Trump?
Yes. My favorite line of the whole night was, Americans are dreamers too. That encompasses everything, because we are. We've always been a nation of dreamers.
So you're bringing up the subject of dreamers. Do you think that dreamers should be allowed to stay in the country?
Absolutely. I think that there is a path to citizenship. I think that the proposal that the president has put on the table is a very viable proposal. And, you know, it's up to Congress to compromise. You know, the best laws, the greatest laws of this nation have been accomplished through compromise.
Now, you were telling me earlier that you are of Cuban-Italian descent.
Yes.
Now, he's talking about an end of the visa lottery, chain migration. Do you think that we will be able to be a nation of immigrants immigrants if we change our current policies?
Of course we will, because there is such a thing as legal immigrants, and all of those immigrants, like my grandfather who came to this country in 1911 and landed in Ellis Island, all of them came legally, okay? And every single country in the world has their own legal borders and legal laws. And I think that they shouldn't be enforced.
Ida, thank you very much. Before we close, I do want to talk to a young Trump supporter. I do want to bring a different angle to this conversation. Ray Anthony, he's 21 years old, a student of FIU. Ray, what do you think?
Well, I thought I was very impressed on Trump's position against totalitarian dictatorships in countries like Cuba and Venezuela, standing with our community here in Miami.
But he didn't mention that during the speech.
Speaking truth to power, that is so important and such a message that is resonating with this president of standing with human rights, activists and people that risk their lives, whether it's in North Korea or in China, in Cuba or in Venezuela. We stand with brave men and women, and we want to be a voice for those people. We don't want to stand on the side of dictators. We want to stand on the side of people who want to make a difference and want to bring freedom and the rule of law, democracy to their countries.
You are a young student. What would you tell to your friends that are dreamers that are studying with you in college?
Well, we have a bipartisan, optimistic plan that's going to be presented in Congress in the next couple days and few weeks. And I think we're to see how our government gets together and produces a law for the benefit of everyone.
Great. Thank you so much for talking to us this evening. Mike, this has been the reaction from the GOP Watch Party here in South Florida. Back at you.
I noticed that Representative Kennedy is speaking behind her, and everyone's left the room. So they were there to watch the president, and then they skedaddled. And Nsinga Burton is the chair of Mass Media Arts at Clark Atlanta University. She's joining us again. I want to get your thoughts about a couple of things, but one of the things that hit me, and I want to get your thoughts on this, was early on in the speech, you said, all of us together as one team, one people, and one American family. We all share the same home, the same heart, the same destiny, and the same great American flag. It almost seemed like a swipe at the Black Lives Matter athletes who have been kneeling during the national anthem, and he's called them out before. Did you see it that way?
I absolutely saw it that way. And I think it is interesting that the president wants people to come together and to forget all of the rhetoric and vitriol he has spewed over the course of his first year in office. It's quite impossible to do that if you are a person of color, if you are a woman. He mentioned University of Virginia, but did not mention the white supremacists at the University of Virginia who terrorized an entire city for days. So, it's very hard, again, to see where this president is going with his rhetoric. It is rhetoric. There's nothing behind it. He doesn't want us to stand together because he wouldn't be taking those kind of swipes, as you say, at people who believe that our lives do matter as much as the next person's.
And Nsinga, if you can briefly, I want to get your thoughts because we heard from somebody there in Southern Florida, they really like Americans are dreamers too. That's obviously a message to the base, but how do you think that would be taken?
Americans are dreamers too.
Yeah.
I think it's the appropriation of a movement that most people who are not in support of dreamers are trying to use that rhetoric. I mean, that is one of President Trump's tactics. That is a rhetorical tactic. Let me appropriate, even this chain migration, which is a pejorative term, has been a pejorative term historically, is now, been appropriated and just used to describe what people have been doing for centuries coming to this country.
Yeah.
So I think it's highly problematic when you appropriate the language of the oppressed and then try to use it as an oppressor and then pretend that it's your language.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for your observations. Let's check in with Nathan King. I want to get your take on overall reaction and the tone of the speech.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a lot of people very happy in the White House tonight. And his supporters here, you heard it in the applause, he seemed presidential. He talked about bringing the country together. He used the guests in the gallery well to explain poignant points about everything from immigration to his feelings about the DPRK's human rights record. However, the question has to be asked, how much of the Donald Trump that we saw in the hall tonight with that speech is actually anything that we've seen over the last year, and how much of it will we see coming out of this hall. You know, his tweets don't sound like that. His daily speeches don't sound like that. His agenda hasn't really been about bringing people together either. So the real question is, if he wants to do this and this agenda and enact this agenda and take this tone, I think the rest of Washington, and let's face it, the world, will take it. The big question is, how long will it last? We've seen these moments before where he's made speeches with people saying he's being presidential. He's trying to bring people together. He's turned over a new leaf, only to see him change back to the campaigning Donald Trump that won him the election, but doesn't win him very many friends in Washington or around the world.
All right, Nathan, thanks so much. Sean, just some final observations. It almost seemed like one of his rallies towards the end, USA, USA, and you're seeing members of Congress. Just a different feel to the State of the Union in what we've seen in the past.
It is. And look, the State of the Union, as I said at the top, is really geared toward people in the United States. But internationally, I can't think this is going to be embraced. He talked about having a better tone, reaching out in a bipartisan fashion. And I really am going to be interested to see how people take this apart in the coming days. And secondly, is he going to tweet in the morning? Let's hear what he says. He'll say, could it be this is the best speech ever given by any president anywhere?
Yeah, undoubtedly looked very presidential, but again, the fact checkers are going to dive deep into all of this. And of course, we are going to have to wait and see what comes with the tweets, but that's our coverage of the State of the Union address. Thanks so much for watching.